Hello again.
Hello, Rob. It's
Hello.
really a great honor to speak with you today. And so, for anyone not knowing Rob Preece is the author of multiple books, including The Psychology of Tantra. And he has a very vast lifetime of both Buddhist and psychotherapist experience. So, Rob went to India in the early 70s, became a student of Lama Zopa and Lama Yeshe. He also spent quite a bit of time in retreat and then later on became a psychotherapist and is actually actively engaging in merging Jungian psychology and Buddhism. And he's also teaching currently retreats, partly, if we remember correctly, also together
Awesome.
with his wife.
Wow.
And yeah, so he's leading retreats and has published multiple books, as mentioned earlier.
That
So
inspired us to that interview and also
yeah,
to include Rob in that teaching series and also to present him to maybe a larger audience, because for every modern Tantra practitioners, probably his suggestions and insights and wisdom is very precious.
so yeah, that brings us, I think, to the first question,
Yeah.
which is what made you go to India in the early 70s and how did you connect with Buddhism?
Yes. That was quite a journey. Um, I guess, I mean, I think it started probably before I was at university, but when I was at university, um, I went through a bit of a kind of psychological crisis, as one often does. And the two things that really helped me to gradually work through that, one was reading lots of Jung, and the other was beginning to read lots of stuff around Buddhism. So the combination of Jung and Buddhism began to be germinated while I was at university, and much to the dismay of my professor, who I was studying psychology, and I kept responding to all the questions and things that they were asking from either a Buddhist or a Jungian point of view, and they weren't very happy about that. Anyway, after university, I decided to travel. And I went actually through Canada and the States, and then over to Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, and eventually to Thailand. And the whole of that journey, things were happening which were quite significant. I think while I was in Canada, I had a very vivid dream that was of a figure sitting very high up, surrounded by lots of very colorful images. And I didn't understand what it was. Um, but probably 8 months or so later, I eventually arrived in Nepal and went to the Copan retreat in November. They have a Copan retreat every November. This was in 1973, I think it was. So I was sitting there in this, it was a big marquee at the time, a big tent. And in front of me was a throne and lots of images. Suddenly Lama Zopa came in and sat on the throne. That was the dream. It was, oh my God, that was what I dreamt when I was in Canada.
Wow.
So it felt like I'd come home, you know, felt like I'd really been traveling and had come back to a place that was clearly somewhere deep inside me was a real strong connection. So then after that course, I came back to the UK and was part of a group that began to put together a Dharma center in the north of England for Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa. And they came over and began to teach in the UK. And then there was a bit of a disaster with the center, which was rather unpleasant. But soon after that, I went back to India and went into retreat from about 1980 through to 85. And your friend Jampa Shanaman, was in the hut next to me on the mountainside.
Oh,
So we met each other up there. And after that retreat, there was a period in India when it was soon after Indira Gandhi was assassinated. They decided they were going to get rid of all the hippies, basically. You know, we were all being thrown out. So I think it was then when Jampa left and I left, came back to the UK, and of course I was unemployable. What was I going to do? I'd just spent 5 years in retreat. What sort of work was I going to do? You know. And it was a logical thing, a natural thing in some senses, to think in terms of studying in psychotherapy and becoming a psychotherapist. And while I was in India, funnily enough, I was in Bodh Gaya for a while, doing lots of prostrations. And while I was there, I was making prayers, may I be able to be of benefit to people that suffered from depression and, you know, psychological disorders. And I was making these prayers at the Bodhi Stupa. And prayers you make at the Bodhi Stupa tend to be quite powerful prayers. So when I got back to England, the whole thing began to kick off, and I began to train as a psychotherapist and worked as a psychotherapist for the next 25 years or so. And of course, it was in that time that I really began to bring together my Jungian background and the Tibetan Buddhist background to start to work in a way that sort of bridged the two, I suppose, began to synthesize the two, some sense of how they work together, how important they are to each other. And that's been the journey ever since, I guess, really, bringing together those two worlds.
Yeah.
And I think I was very fortunate in that Lama Yeshe, my primary teacher, was incredibly supportive of that. You know, he was very keen on Western psychology and Buddhism being brought together so that we as Westerners could kind of get a good experience of particularly Tantric tradition. Yeah.
Exactly. It's very unique for the traditional Tibetan teacher to really be supportive of that, because in ancient Tibet, there was a little bit different reality, and maybe the community was supporting a lot of different human functions. So maybe there was not as much need to combine these two worlds, but so leading to the next question, what would you think is that role of emotions for the modern tantrika, for the modern practitioner of Tibetan Buddhism? Because for many, often it's something very distinct, our emotional or relative world and my formal or informal practice.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that became very clear to me when I was in retreat was that one of the, I wouldn't say obstacles, but something that I came up against and could see I needed to do more work on was my psychological background. You know, I could do tantric practices and I could do lots of meditation practices, but there was a point where there was a certain limitation in that because my own psychological stuff was getting in the way. So it made me very aware that when I came back to the West, I needed to do that work. And that was kind of ironic. I was doing that after I'd been in retreat. I think if I had done that work before I went in retreat, perhaps my retreats would have gone deeper. You know, so I was aware of the limitation of that. But I also think that it was something, as I say, that Lama Yeshe encouraged, and he was very unusual in that. I think I think he recognized that as Westerners, we're quite different to Tibetans. We have a different psychological makeup. We have different psychological issues, problems, trauma, whatever you want to call it. And I'm not sure that Tibetan teachers necessarily always comprehend that. Why would they? That's not their background. You know, this is something that we as Westerners have to look at and work with and find a way to bring into our practice. So I think it was very fortunate that he somehow or other, recognizing that, was really encouraging us to do the work. And I think it's not that everyone chooses to do that, but I could see for myself that the danger of doing quite intensive tantric practices, for example, and not doing that psychological work is that we can put a kind of veneer of practice over psychological issues that aren't going away. They're not being resolved. They're just being buried in some way. And it's that the danger of doing that, I think, is really quite strong, actually. And then some years down the road, we realize, actually, I haven't done that work. I need to do it because it's becoming an obstacle in some way. And I didn't want to do that. I could see the problems. I could see my psychological issues. So I felt I wanted to address those straight away. Yeah. So that was partly why I did the psychotherapy training. But you bring up another question about working with emotion. Yeah, emotional process. And in a sense, that's part of the same picture, isn't it? That if I don't find ways to work with emotional process, then my practice just becomes a bit of the bypassing idea. You know, it can be bypassing. So yeah, I think working with the emotional process for tantric practitioners is in particularly important, you know. And for another reason, which is that when we think about how tantric practice works, I guess one could say that right at the heart of it is how we work with the subtle body or the emotional body. Sorry, the subtle body or the energy body, which in a sense we can call the emotional body. And if we're not bringing our practice quite deeply into relationship with that aspect of our nature, then what's transforming? You know, the energy body is so central to tantric practice, and the energy body is where our emotional life is alive and well, you know. And so if we're going to be really transforming in the tantric practice process, then our emotional life is part of it. We can't avoid that.
Yeah.
You know, the energy body is going to be stimulating emotional processes.
Yeah.
And
also it
we
sounds
need
like,
to,
yeah. And also sounds like you're talking from experience. So if you could also say how the trauma, that our individual traumas that we have can be used as an ally on our path to enlightenment.
Actually, maybe in the context of trauma, just if also one question would be, besides the obvious traumas of rape or violence, I think as Westerners we have like underlying traumas that maybe many of us we don't even realize that we have those psychological issues. So if you could maybe touch on that as well, what would particular traumas of Westerners?
Yeah. I mean, I think something that became very obvious to me in terms of my own relationship to this path I was on was that one of the biggest difficulties was that I wasn't very much in touch with my body. You know, I was a bit disembodied. I was up in my head. And certainly for the first probably, I don't know, 5 or 10 years of my practice, I was studying lots of philosophy and all this sort of thing, Buddhist philosophy. So I was very heady. I was really up in my head. And when I started to do tantric practice, I was doing it in my head.
Yeah.
And you know what was going on beneath my head was a bit of a mystery. And so it became very clear to me that actually coming back into the body was central to my relationship to the practice. And of course, that's where the energy body lives. You know, that is the how to say, the vessel of the energy body, the emotional body. It's all there in our physical body. And if we're not very embodied as Westerners, then that becomes such an important initial step. You know, if we're going to begin to embark on tantric practice, we have to do it in the body. We have to come back into the body. Well, that's the tricky bit, isn't it? Because if we have experienced trauma of some sort, then our natural tendency is to become disembodied. So we're working with a bit of a challenge there, a bit of a paradox or something, that yes, we need to get back into the body, but that means we'll come back into relationship with whatever it was that caused us to leave the body in the first place. So that trauma work, if you like, as you say, it doesn't have to be gross, extreme trauma. It could be just early emotional wounding, you know, from early on in our life. It doesn't have to be strong trauma, but it's going to be there in the body and it's going to be in the energy body. And so if we come back into relationship with that and begin to work with that process, it requires a lot of skill, a lot of care, a lot of careful exploration, because you can't suddenly drop back into the body and all of that is there. How do I deal with it? How do I work with it? So I think that's also where having a psychological understanding alongside the tantric or the Buddhist understanding is really crucial, because it's not straightforward that just because I start to do a deity practice or something and all of that begins to awaken some sort of traumatic process, how do I then work with that? It often requires a lot of careful inquiry, a lot of gradual support to work with that kind of process, I think, really. And I'm glad that the work that I tend to do, and particularly work with my wife, with Anna, we do a lot of work with relatively small groups in retreat, where when any kind of traumatic process begins to arise, that's part of the process. That's the process of practice. And that's where the practice is, if you like. And the more we can support that and hold that with a kind of compassionate, safe environment, then that can be incredibly transformational.
Yes, and exactly, and how to explain maybe to some people that that might be an ally to your practice and not an obstacle.
I think that's where if we can develop the understanding or the appreciation that our practice is about clearing through and releasing whatever's there, and that that's not bad or wrong or is not a problem, then if we can hold that kind of attitude or that kind of compassionate space, then actually it supports people to know it's all right that this is happening, rather than, oh, I should be getting blissful, realizations. And instead what I'm getting is painful experiences. If we can reassure people that actually that is the work, that's the process, and that is really beneficial in the long run because it's being liberated and moved through. So having that attitude, I think, is an important start, so that we're really holding a compassionate presence with what's arising and seeing it as being that this is the path, actually.
Yeah. And actually sorry.
No, go on.
On that note, there is also a very important aspect in Tibetan Buddhism philosophy of the relative and absolute truth. And in the context even of the trauma and our emotional struggles and realities, there is often a tendency of either misconstruing that concept and disassociating maybe our problems from our practice, but also then to perceive the ultimate as something disassociated from our body almost, and that relative as something unwanted. So how would you say that can be brought forth to the modern practitioner to understand what is the difference between relative and absolute reality in order to feed our understanding of emptiness, but also the accountability for what is happening?
Yeah. I'm reminded of a phrase that apparently Milarepa said, which was, "It's easy to meditate upon the sky, but it's difficult to meditate upon the clouds."
Good one.
I think that sort of answers it on some level, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. If I see my view as being, let's just go towards ultimate truth and emptiness, then there is the hazard of actually veering towards a nihilistic sort of age as well, isn't there? But I think the place where this becomes really important is around the sense of self, actually, the ego. And I think there can be a hazard for some of us when we meet the Buddhist tradition of thinking that the intention of Buddhism is to get rid of the self. Yeah. That the message is there is no self, so let's get rid of it. And actually in the 60s, I remember when the Zen tradition first came to the West, the message was very much, well, there's no ego. And so a lot of us were just kind of, well, there's no ego, so what's the problem? Just do nothing, sort of thing.
Yeah.
It was a very nihilistic kind of view, but then we were all hippies, and it was kind of, it suited us. But I think there's a much deeper understanding of this, isn't there? And we know that psychologically we need an ego. If we don't have a sense of self, then psychologically we can be in a bit of a mess, and there's the potential for psychoses if we lack a sense of self. So it's really important that we understand the difference between between emptiness of self and the sense of self.
Mhm.
And I guess that's not always obvious to begin with, but if we think of the root of the issue, as it were, the root of the issue is not having a sense of self, it's ego grasping. It's that duxing, contraction around a sense of self that turns it into something that's hot, that's solid and kind of eternal. That contraction into a strong sense of me. In a way, that's the bit that's the problem. And it's that bit that if we can recognize it doesn't actually exist in that way, there is no solid, substantial, enduring me. It doesn't mean that there isn't a relatively ongoing sense of self that functions in the world. You know, so I'm sitting here talking, there is a relative sense of self that's doing that. What there doesn't have to be is that contracted me that's holding on to something as though it's solid. And those two things are not always easily differentiated, but it's really crucial that we do. Otherwise, we get rid of the wrong thing, you know. And I think in my early years as a Buddhist, I had the impression that I had to have no self at all, and became a little bit kind of formless and you know, a bit wafty, rather than there being a sense of actually I am here. There is a sense of me. I just don't need to contract into it as though it was self-existent, solid. So that distinction, I think, in terms of relative and ultimate, if that's what you're pointing towards, I think that's really important.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
actually,
that's very profound. Yeah.
very profound. And actually on that practice level, that's exactly what are teaching us Yidam practices, because they still point out to the sense of self, because you embody Yidam, but the Yidam is not that constricted sense of self. It also has a connection to emptiness and everything in that reality. So yeah, thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah, and I mean, just to sort of follow that for a moment, when we think about tantric practice, if our sense of self was solid or was kind of enduring, then there's no potential for transformation.
Yes, exactly.
You know, the reason we can transform, the reason that the whole process of tantric practice enables us to go through that transformational process is because the sense of self is empty ultimately. And that doesn't mean to say that there isn't a sense of self that is doing the practice, that is engaging in the practice, and so on. But that lack of inherent nature means that it's always creative. There's always something about a creative, how do you say, a natural spontaneity of creativity in the tantric process. Yeah, because it's always changing, always evolving. Very exciting.
Playful tantric theater.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like jazz.
Mm.
You know, that sense of spontaneity and that can only be possible if we're not contracting around a sense of self as something solid, and instead recognizing this is fluid. It's always changing.
But
free.
on a relative level, it's still there.
And
we
on a
need to
relative
deal with
level,
that.
it functions. Yeah. It was interesting for me when I was in India one time listening to His Holiness the Dalai Lama teach. He made a comment about the bodhisattva, saying that actually a bodhisattva needs quite a strong ego. And we were sitting there thinking, what do you mean, strong ego? What he meant was that actually to cope with the life of a bodhisattva in the world, trying to sort of in some way support the welfare of others, you need a pretty robust sense of self. That isn't to say ego grasping, but we need a strong enough sense of identity to have the capacity to engage with that process.
Oh, never heard that. Yeah.
And that I think was His Holiness saying that was, yeah, I get that. So it's not about just let's get rid of the ego and there's nothing left. There's that relative capacity to engage in the world that is not grasping, it's not contracting, it's not solidifying.
Makes a lot
That
of
is a very nice comment of His Holiness.
Yeah, you present a lot of wonderful clarity on this matter. So that's really incredible. I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate a bit more also for what you mentioned earlier, that when we go into maybe too much emptiness or too much on the maybe just the spacing out on the meditative level.
Yeah.
And in that way, we just push aside the relative issues of our human self, like how to avoid that or how to become aware. Because I think a problem with that is often that it happens unconsciously.
Yeah, yeah,
Have
sure,
all
sure.
the dead corpses lying
Yeah.
around, but because we are up here,
With
Mhm.
it might be obvious for other people, but not for ourselves. So
Yeah,
how for
yeah,
us as individuals, or especially as practitioners, how can we get awareness to the things that are unconscious?
yeah. I mean, I think it's always helpful having a partner.
Yeah. The best mirror ever.
Exactly. You know, when you're going off in that, if your partner says, "Oh, come on," it's
Yeah,
very
very
helpful,
good.
isn't it?
It is.
So in that level, I think our relationships and our life will challenge us
Mhm.
around it, actually. I think so that I think there is a natural mechanism. If I'm getting a bit too spaced out and a bit, lost in some sort of spiritual idealism,
Mhm.
um, the bills still come in.
Mhm.
We still have to earn the livelihood and that sort of thing. So those practical things will shout at us if we don't address it, I think. That's certainly been my experience, that I could be very, how do you say, I just want to go off and meditate, but actually practically we still have to live in this world, don't we? So there is a very natural way in which I think our lives bring us back down to earth.
Mhm.
And in some senses, that's partly what you're saying, isn't it? How do we stay grounded? How do we stay in the world and at the same time open to these extraordinary possibilities of our practice
Yeah.
and not just get lost in that?
Mhm.
And it's, maybe that's where the whole bodhisattva ideal needs to be one about being grounded and being in the world and recognizing our place in the world, rather than I'm just going to head off into some spiritual transcendent place. So
Mhm.
that's one element of it. I suppose the other side of it is going to be, um, maybe to do with shadow, where we're unconscious of some of our patterns and our habits, and I don't know that we can always recognize it until something brings it out.
Mhm.
But I also think that life brings these things out if we're awake to it and willing to look at what goes on. And there's a phrase that, I use at the beginning of that book that you have there, Tasting the Essence of Tantra. Um, the phrase is, yeah, this one. A quick plug. The phrase, definite emergence. In the first or second chapter, I talk about definite emergence as opposed to renunciation. It's the same. The Tibetan word ngejung is often translated as renunciation, but the actual more literal translation would be definite emergence. And and the implication of that is the willingness to wake up and to face what I'm not facing in myself, rather than to deny things or to try and push things away. But that willingness to wake up and to really engage with who I am, to face, where I do things that are inappropriate or where I'm getting caught up in unconscious habits and this sort of thing.
I think Lama Jampa is using the phrase spiritual determination for
Yeah,
enunciation.
yeah, quite. And that's useful so long as it doesn't separate us from the world.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
You know, we're not, I think one of the things that's very clear about Buddhism as a spiritual tradition, we're not trying to transcend in the sense of getting away from embodied life, are we really? We're staying embodied, we're staying in the world
Absolutely.
in order that we can be of service to others. So
That's the whole point of being Nirmanakaya.
exactly, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And aren't we lucky? We have this incredible, potential to do that if we use it. Yeah.
And well, so in a way, you touch really on a lot of incredible bridging between the practicalities of a human life and spirituality. So I'm wondering, would you say that the Vajrayana or Buddhism is lacking something, or it's just a lack of translating art, is it for us Westerners? Because many presentations of Buddhist teachings, I think, lack what you are presenting us here. So would you say that Vajrayana itself does not have really that knowledge of how to bring those exalted states of meditation and Yidam practice into life, or it's really just how we make it suitable for us Westerners?
I think it's the latter. I think it's, I think the essence of how Vajrayana works and how tantric practice works, and you touched on the Nirmanakaya thing. We have these three kayas, and those three kayas, Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, and Nirmanakaya, that process is working through us all the time. If we understand how to work with that in a embodied way. So I don't think there's anything missing specifically with Vajrayana. I think, or the tantric tradition. I think the way it's been practiced maybe in Tibet is different to the way we need to practice it.
Yeah.
Actually. It's an incredibly rich tradition they've created, and they love that richness. They love the complexity, and that it's something to do with how the Tibetans do their thing. Is that entirely useful for us as Westerners? I'm not sure. I think our lives are incredibly complex. I'm not sure that we want more complexity. And in some senses, simplifying the process of practice
Mm-hmm.
can mean that we can gain the experience of it more immediately, more directly, and embody that more simply.
Mm-hmm.
All the time we're caught up in incredibly complex liturgies and this sort of thing. Is that necessarily what we as Westerners need? I'm not entirely sure. I mean, having gone through that tradition myself and come to a place of thinking, actually, am I getting this, or do I need to approach it in a different way? And I think my choice, supported, a lot by Lama Yeshe, was to do it a slightly different way and to bring more space, to bring more sense of how do I digest this process into my life in a more embodied way. And I think it's possible. I don't think that's the flaw of the tantric process or the tantric tradition.
Mm-hmm.
I think it can be that we need to translate it from what's been Tibetan Buddhism into a more Western style. And it's interesting. I found it interesting to hear His Holiness say something once. He said that he didn't think that the way the Mahasiddhas of India practiced Tantra was the same as the Tibetans, that they didn't have the same degree of complexity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, historically, Buddhism tend to take on the shape of the culture it was translated into. So maybe also our needs with overstimulated minds, it's actually not that complexity of the ritualism, but actually nailing the actionables in our daily life, how to distinguish what's vital for us.
Yes, absolutely. And I think my sense of that was that the vital bit for me was being in the body, was being in relationship to the energy body and the emotional process, because that's where the if you like, the real work of the tantric process transforms us. So if we orientate more towards that, then actually this is an incredibly valuable tradition because it's helping us to work with that process. And that doesn't have to be just on the cushion. We have that energy body and we have those three kayas, whether we're on the cushion or whether we're doing DIY, and I'm a great DIY fan, or have been. And actually, those three kayas are functioning just as well when I'm doing some DIY or if I was doing some gardening or if I was, anything, something that's practical, something that is creative, that can become, in a sense, an element of tantric practice.
Oh, well, this is very exciting, and in a way that maybe also relates a bit that how we Westerners will adopt Buddhism is a little bit more like the Mahasiddhas in India did it,
Quite.
rather than the ritualized Tibetan tradition. But so when you say so DIY gardening, is incredible to incorporate into one's Buddhist practice, maybe also in the psychological healing process.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
you could elaborate a little bit on that, like as a practical advice for the average Western Buddhist, how do we merge our Dharma practice, our maybe psychological healing journey with our daily activities?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a big subject in some respects, you know, and a very exciting one, because I think that's where all of the process of tantric practice comes alive in a different way. And in some senses, at the heart of this has got to be that awareness of being in the body and in the energy body.
Mm.
If we're not inhabiting that aspect of our nature, then whatever creative process we're engaged in is not really going to be transformational. So if I'm still up in the head, it's not going to be transformational. So I think for me that two things. One is that being really well embedded in that awareness of the energy body. And the other is the practice of Mahamudra, actually.
Mhm.
Yeah, that capacity to have a more spacious, open, clear, present awareness while I'm engaging with what I'm doing, you know, so that I can move within I can shift from the process of movement and activity into the place of stillness and openness and awareness, and then maybe move back into activity again. That interrelationship between those two processes is so transformational. And I think the interesting thing for me is that when His Holiness pointed to the Mahasiddhas in India, if you look at their lives, many of them were craftsmen. They were, one was a veena player, you know, one was a leather worker, one was made arrows. They were craftsmen, and they were practitioners of Mahamudra, and they had some tantric practice as well. So that lifestyle that includes a creative process, I think, can be a very rich way of transforming in our tantric practice. And you know, you've got these amazing statues of Yamataka behind you. If I want to bring that into my daily life, it needs to come through the body, doesn't it? In some ways. So I'm actually feeling the energetic presence of that in what I do in my DIY. So when I'm sawing a piece of wood, Yamataka is sawing a piece of wood.
Brilliant. And it is also so true for every type of healing process. It's also not only intellectual, it's not only up in the concepts, it's also in most of the time embodied. It's being stored somewhere that needs to get in touch with.
Absolutely. And if we're working as psychotherapists, then in a sense, if we can bring people back into relationship with that, then that's where the transformation happens again, isn't it, really? Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe that is incredible introduction to what we are hoping to develop with you, maybe over a period of a few weeks series in the near future. And maybe as a final question, we would ask you for some inspiring stories from your retreat. Maybe if you have any, or of your teachers, to entice anybody to practice or to get in touch with that lineage.
Oh gosh. Now you've got me.
Yeah, 5 years, it's a long period of time, and I guess it was not only then, you continue your practice now, and maybe either some aha moments or any moments of realization of emptiness that were significant for your journey.
Do you know, there's an irony in what you're asking.
Mm.
I think, and this isn't exactly answering your question, but I think one of the things that became very clear to me while I was in retreat was that I did an awful lot of striving to achieve realizations. But that wasn't necessarily where the realizations came. You know, the realizations would nearly always come from some kind of something happening that was maybe quite painful or distressing or whatever. But suddenly those aha moments that come within that. So I think I was initially I was under the impression that tantric practice led to these exotic, wonderful states. But my experience of it was that they often came through something that wasn't so exotic, so exciting. But just to respond a little bit to what you're asking, when I was in retreat, where I lived, and Jampa could tell you more about this as well, was very high up above McLeod Ganj on the mountainside towards Triand. And some of the things that used to happen while I was in retreat were extraordinary in relationship to the land around and the weather and the environment around. And I think some of the most wonderful times were when there'd just been an incredible storm and the sky began to clear, but the clouds all dropped. And so I was looking out across this ocean of cloud, and then the moon would come up, and it might be a sort of pink moon radiating across this ocean of cloud. Times like that were just awesome, just wonderful. And it made the kind of periods of struggle in retreat just, blow away, sort of thing. I think probably one thing I would want to say is that Lama Yeshe was such an inspiration to me. He had this extraordinary capacity to just take some theme that he wanted to talk about and really communicate to us as Westerners in a very intuitive language. He was very unorthodox in the way he taught. He had a tremendous sense of humor, and was just one kind of constant loving presence. He used to sit on the throne sometimes when he was teaching, and we would just bathe in his kind of the atmosphere he would create. And I felt very fortunate that on occasions I was able to go and speak to him privately, go and see him privately. And I remember saying to him one time, there was often a bit of a feeding frenzy around him, all the students. So, we've got to have a bit of Lama. And I was, you know what I mean? And I was up in retreat, so I didn't see him that often. So I knew that all of my friends were all, clamoring for a bit of Lama. So when I came down one time, I had dinner with him one evening, and I said to him, I don't see you very often, and all of your students get so much time with you. And he said, "Don't worry, dear. We have good communication," he said. and it was a time when I asked him a particular question about how things dissolve into Dharmakaya and then emerge out of Dharmakaya. That sort of relationship between the relative and ultimate, if you like. And we were sitting at his table, and he had one of these lamps, these lamps that sort of have a head that moves around, angle poise lamps, we call them. He had one of these lamps, and it was shining down the table. And I was sitting over there, and he was sitting here. And I asked him the question, and he said, well, it's like this. And things come out of Dharmakaya, and he moved into the light. And then he leant back, and he disappeared. Came out again. So he's moving in and out of the light. And I was just, oh, yeah, I get it.
We had it right now as well, because you have the lamp close to the screen. So we had that.
Did you? Oh, right.
Demonstration, yeah.
So, yeah, he was just rocking backwards and forwards into Dharmakaya, out of Dharmakaya. It was a magical moment.
Yeah, demonstrating rather than using a lot of concepts. Yeah.
No, he was very special, and I have such appreciation for his, in a way, his encouragement for me to do what I've been doing over the years. That I think without that, because what I'm doing is unorthodox, I accept that. I'm doing something that is not strictly traditional Tibetan Buddhist practice. I'm reshaping it for us as Westerners. I don't think I would do that with the same degree of comfort if it wasn't for the encouragement of Lama Yeshe, who was demonstrating something very similar, and saying this is what we need to do. And that's been important for me, because the authority of the tradition is very powerful.
Mhm.
It's a powerful tradition, and to actually start to feel that something needs to be done differently is to question the tradition, is to question the sort of orthodoxy. And I have great appreciation for the tradition. I love the tradition, but I'm also aware that I'm not a Tibetan.
Mhm.
I have to do this differently.
Yeah.
And I'm very thankful that Lama Yeshe supported that, because it makes it possible. For me, it makes it possible.
Mhm.
That's immensely inspiring. Thank you so much. And also, I think encouraging others to look at the Buddhism from a more realistic point of view of their standpoint, rather than repeating something that was for a period of time just replicated in a certain way.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that requires a lot of courage, and not having maybe a confirmation or acknowledgement or like of authorities that, well, we need to submit and
Yes, quite.
certain standards, but it's not for the sense of validation, and that requires a courage. And
It,
even
it does. And I think, again, repeating something that Lama Yeshe said to me many times, and to a lot of us as students, he would often repeat two things. One, you need to trust your inner guru.
Mhm.
And he would say, trust your inner knowledge, wisdom, dear, he used to say.
oh.
Yeah. And we'd ask him questions, so you trust your own wisdom. And I think that was incredibly encouraging, incredibly empowering
Mhm.
Yeah.
to really, and I think he was saying that partly because we do have to find how this works for us.
Mhm.
We could just follow the liturgy, off we go, or we can find some way, how does this really work for me?
Yeah.
What works, what doesn't work, perhaps, and not just cherry picking, but a real sense of how is this going to work in my life? How is it going to work for
And it's also enclosed in your other book title, Feeling Wisdom.
But yeah,
About
and the wisdom of imperfection.
yeah,
Mhm.
exactly.
That I wrote that based on, actually, I'm learning from my mistakes, not just from these realizations that I'm supposed to get.
Yeah. And even what you have mentioned at the beginning, answering this question, like this expectation, striving to achieve something when there is there when we stop striving.
Yeah, that's right. That's the irony, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, when I was in retreat, I was trying so hard, and actually, it wasn't until I gave that up, something began to open out. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's very powerful to hear from you. Very powerful insights.
You're
So,
welcome.
Rob, thank you so very much for your time, for your presence, and for anyone listening in. We will put Rob Preece's website below the video in the description, also with the links to all the books and also
Thank you.
the archive teaching series.
Yeah. Yep.
So yeah, you as the viewer, you can stay in touch with Rob Preece, but also we hope eventually maybe we'll have a little series where we could host Rob for our international Sangha friends to yeah, maybe teach something on bridging the practicalities of human life and our tantric practices.
Yeah.
Yeah, possibly.
And for now, if you want to reach Rob Preece in his achievements in sharing his wisdom and practical indications for the tantrikas, for the Buddhist practitioners of nowadays, you can reach for some of his books, like
Yeah, well, then we
yeah,
close
maybe you
the
can
stream. So yeah,
This is the commercial break.
the psychology of Buddhist Tantra.
And actually, at the beginning, everyone, I would recommend this small book, can be really very transformational.
Yes, Chenrezig, Embodying Compassionate Presence, is a really an eye-opener because in a way it does present the traditional presentation of Chenrezig practice, action tantra practice.
But also from psychological point of view.
How to actually make that work with our inner child, with how to embody compassionate presence. So it's very, very beautiful.
Yeah. Recent beautiful achievement.
Tasting the essence of Tantra.
Yeah.
Heart essence.
Or
Here we go.
The mandala and visions of wholeness. Wow.
Yeah.
And there are more books to come, right?
There's one coming out before Christmas on Tara.
yes.
And there's another one on Manjushri and Heruka Vajrasattva.
Yeah, I'm hunting on those.
Okay. And thank you to you two as well. And the interesting questions. And I hope this has been helpful.
Yes,
Yes,
it's very helpful.
certainly it is. Thank
And
you
it's
so much.
refreshing to hear your clarity on the topic and also obviously experience as well. So thank you so very much.
Thank you. I wish you well with your center as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And hopefully we are hoping to host you soon for more.